everyone, and welcome to our brand new video series, which is all about property. I'd love to introduce you to my co-host, Mr. Tom Haigh from My Money Sorted. He's a licensed buyer's agent with a 16-year career in property and construction. He helps small business owners and professionals buy investment-grade properties, and he's the best footballer to have never played first grade from his high school footy team. So lucky we've got him here for his property expertise. Welcome, Tom.
Oh, thank you, Jackie. Appreciate the warm intro. It's certainly the first time I've been introduced by it like that, but I'll take it.
I practiced it. Okay, let's get straight into things. We've got a lot of content to cover. So I'd love to start with a what's hot, what's not property edition. So take it away.
Sure thing. Well, let's start with what's not. Right now, there is no denying it. Melbourne is on the nose for investors, and we're going to dive deep into why this is the case in just a little while. But for now, I want to touch on a real sore point in the age-old battle between Melbourne and Sydney. Now, between the two biggest capitals, we are seeing the greatest divide between median house prices that we've seen in the last 20 years. There's close to a $350,000 difference between median house prices in both of the cities, which is huge. And to make matters worse for Melburnians, we're now starting to see Adelaide house prices catch up with Melbourne. Yikes. And for what's hot, for investors right now, Perth, Adelaide and Brisbane are going off like a frog in a sock. But this is no new news, with suburbs in Perth experiencing close to 27% growth in the past 12 months. Now, this is being driven by affordability, an increase in net migration and a new resources boom in the West. So really interesting to see that play out over in Perth.
Yeah, awesome. And so what are some key trends and their driving factors that you're noticing at the moment?
Yeah, Jackie, there are two main factors to talk about today related to really the supply-demand imbalance out there. This continues to play out and is very much buffering the market from what many predicted would be a serious downturn. Now, obviously, we're in the face of some serious interest rate headwinds. Let's unpack that a little bit. Behind the imbalance sits a couple of key drivers. We've got population growth, and we've got a housing supply issue. Now, the supply-demand equation is completely out of whack. In terms of population growth, according to data recently released by the ABS, Australia's population increased by 2.5%, or 659,000 people, in the 12 months to September 2023. Now, net overseas migration accounted for 83% of that growth during that time. There are a few little nuances to unpack about that migration data. We are seeing migration hotspots, so a greater concentration of these new Australians where they're choosing to reside and the impact or the flow through that's having on housing markets. Of course, New South Wales had the highest rate of net overseas migration, with 186,000 people arriving, which is just nuts. Now, followed by Victoria at 161,000 and Queensland at 88,000. Northern Territory had the lowest level of migration with just 3,000 people. Now, there are also some other interesting trends that are emerging, which is people moving from their home state for greener pastures, so to speak. Now, should we get into that, Jackie? Would you like to know where people are leaving and where they're going?
They're probably leaving Sydney, Melbourne and moving up to the beautiful sunshine state of Queensland, which is where I live. Is that right?
Well, it's like you scripted this, Jackie, because Queensland really must be still beautiful one day and perfect the next, because it's continued to be the most popular place for Australians to move to, with the state's population growing by 32,000 people due to interstate arrivals in the year to September 2023. Now, Western Australia came in second, growing by 11,000 residents, while interestingly, New South Wales was the least popular, losing 33,000 people to other parts of the country.
Wow. I mean, I can see why everyone's coming up here, but
It's long been a popular location for retirees, of course, Jackie, but now it's proving to be popular to a much wider demographic. And there's good reason behind that, of course. Affordability, weather, the climate, beautiful place to live. There are lots of attractions to obviously Queensland and obviously Brisbane and southeast Queensland, particularly capturing a huge chunk of those people. The other really challenging thing that we're seeing right now, and another major factor in why housing continues to be such a strong market, property such a strong market, is new housing starts at an 11-year low. Now, we are so far behind target in terms of the new dwellings that we want to supply to keep up with demand. Estimates are that we're about a third behind of where we need to be. So roughly speaking, that'll be about 90,000 homes we fall short of this year in terms of our national target of 240,000 new dwellings. So it's no good news for, I guess, the affordable housing front for those who are obviously looking at an affordable entry point into the market. Obviously, dwelling commencements is a major issue. So there are a couple of things that are behind that, of course. Outdated planning policy. Another major factor right now, which we'll touch on in a moment, is cost of construction being really prohibitive. And of course, it's a really challenging thing to be able to actually go and secure debt or a loan to start building a new home when house prices are up by about 30%, build prices up by about 30% since the start of the pandemic.
Just mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing.
It is. It is absolutely mind-blowing. It's scary and obviously evidence of why the market continues to kick along at the rate it does. So the existing housing market is really, for the most part, the only option for people who want to get into housing, particularly first-home buyers. And of course, touch on in a moment the difference in the trends between owner-occupiers and investors, where they're heading, where they're not. But for now, I think it'd be a great opportunity to chat to you about clearance rates, because this is obviously such a good indicator of the health of the market. Should we go into that?
Yeah, let's do it. Clearance rates.
Okay, so I'm going to take you through the major capital cities here. Now, these are clearance rates as at 27th of May, according to data provided by Domain. Now, in Sydney, we saw clearance rates, so auction clearance rates at 66%. Melbourne languishing on 59%, so getting really low, almost to the point where you would not run a auction campaign. That's starting to get to a pretty low level. Brisbane, 44%. So obviously auctions not going that well in Brisbane, despite the market being pretty strong. Adelaide are up at 69%. So leading the charge there in terms of clearance rates, and Canberra at 56%. So now we haven't mentioned Perth, Darwin, or of course Hobart and Tassie, only because there's very few auctions happening there at present. So statistically not that reliable to touch on that. What I would suggest we have a look at though, Jackie, is the change in dwelling values. Would you like to unpack that?
Yes, please. Take it away. You're the expert.
Well, this is where things get really interesting. Now, as I mentioned earlier, markets are really defying the interest rate odds at the moment due to that issue of population growth and a limited supply of new housing. Now, in Sydney, it's crazy to say this, but we've got median dwelling values sitting at $1.15 million, which is just nuts. Now, it's a fair contrast, of course, to Melbourne that we mentioned earlier, where median dwelling prices are at $783,000. I mentioned that Adelaide were, I guess, nipping at the heels of Melbourne's prices. Adelaide's sitting at $747K. The really interesting to look at in terms of the last 12 months and market performance across the cities has been growth. Now, leading the charge by an absolute country mile is Perth, where median dwelling prices have in cases increased by 27% in the last 12 months, which is insane. Now, it has been a long time between boom market for Perth investors and Perth owner-occupiers. It's been a really tricky decade in the lead up to this point. So they're finally starting to peg back a little bit of those gains. And of course, I mentioned that Adelaide and Brisbane were also really strong markets at the moment. So Brisbane experiencing 21% growth in the last 12 months, and Adelaide just shy of that at around 19%. Now, compare that to growth that we've seen in Sydney and Melbourne. So respectively, Sydney at 12% and Melbourne just at 6% for the last 12 months. So a very different state of affairs across the major capitals there.
Yeah, okay. But I don't think I'll ever get over those Sydney dwelling rates. That is just through the roof.
It really is nuts, isn't it? You know, and you do have to, we're going to touch on affordable suburbs for first-time buyers in Sydney in a moment. But as we'll look at, it's really, I guess, turning into a market where it's very, very difficult to get into. Certainly evidence of why rent vesting has become really popular for Sydney-siders who are looking to get into the market but just simply cannot afford to own where they want to live.
Yeah. And so even though we're talking about so many stats and numbers right now, I would love if another edition of this video series where we can actually go a bit deeper to explore different options for first home buyers or even first-time investors, because everyone knows how difficult this current climate is right now. So maybe that's a special episode that we can do just dedicated to those people, because for me, I definitely fall into that bracket, first home buyer, trying to get in. It is really tough. So yeah, even though we are rattling off some pretty heavy numbers right now, it'd be great to come back and just kind of help everyone see that we can help you through this.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jackie. I think affordability is such a hot topic at the moment, or lack thereof, unfortunately, in many cases. But I think there's such great opportunities for first home buyers in the regional markets, particularly, where really prices don't truly reflect values. That's a big one. So bang for buck, you can still obviously buy a great home in a really desirable location. It's really just about looking at obviously scratching below the surface to understand those markets a bit more intimately. So how strong is the local economy there to support obviously jobs and wage growth, which will obviously have a flow through to then the likely growth in housing prices and the strength of that market over time. But I agree. Let's dedicate an episode to that one because we could talk about that one all day.
Sounds good. And so what are some insights you can offer up regarding any notable shifts you're seeing in the market at the moment?
There's a really big one at the moment, Jackie, on the supply side. Referencing some listing data here from Kent Larder at Suburb Trends. Does a great job of unpacking some really granular stuff, Kent. There's an interesting story to tell here. So overall national listings, so the amount of homes that are listed for sale on the market right now, are down 9% on this time last year, meaning there are far fewer options for home buyers out there. Now, at a capital city level, it's a very different story. In Melbourne, where we touched on a little bit earlier, it's just sort of languishing at the moment. Listings are up by 12.5%. Compared to Perth, where there are 24% fewer properties on the market than this time last year. So obviously contrasting markets, Melbourne compared to Perth. Many more options for home buyers in Melbourne, and obviously a good reason that growth has been subdued, and many fewer options for home buyers and investors in Perth. And obviously that's resulting in the kind of crazy growth that we are seeing at the moment, have seen over the last 12 months. For investors, there's a real shift happening at the moment in terms of a lot of money going from east to west. So a lot of those investors who previously favoured, I guess, the Melbourne and Sydney markets in particular are flooding to the west. Adelaide is now turning into Radelaide for investors, becoming really popular as a location to go and buy that investment property, again, driven by affordability, reasonable yields, so decent rental returns. And as we touched on earlier, Jackie, Brisbane and Southeast Queensland are no longer just places Victorians go to retire. They are becoming popular for other reasons, notably affordability, and again, off the back of some relatively strong rental yields and good potential for capital growth side. There is an interesting thing happening on the supply side. Now, there is a real difference in the owner-occupier investor activity across the states, as I mentioned, but the real shift in power that's happening, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, is owner-occupiers really dominating proceedings. Now, the driving factors here, as we touched on, is really just the lack of affordability for investors, which of course is a product of higher interest rates, higher median house prices. Mm-hmm. So despite seeing considerable growth in rents over the last 12 years, many of the best blue chip markets for property investors, for growth investors particularly, presenting some serious cash flow issues. Many properties that perhaps were neutral or slightly positively geared in the early 2020s being firmly in the negatively geared category. So I think it's going to be a little time before we see investors really generate a lot of activity in those markets until, of course, we see considerable growth in rental incomes, yields, and a greater ability for those investors to hold. So a lot to unpack there, of course, but the underlying theme here, of course, is investors are favouring affordability and yields over those more expensive markets at the moment.
Of course. And can I ask a quick follow-up question? Is there any flow-on effect regarding those investors with negatively geared properties? Are they kind of holding and kind of digging their heels in and just hoping for this to brush over, or a lot of them just upping and selling? Are there any numbers coming out of that at the moment?
Yeah, the big one there, Jackie, is what we're seeing play out in Melbourne. So this is not purely off the back of, I guess, interest rates and obviously soft returns. It's also a result of some recent policy changes. Now, this is not a fresh change. The hot issue is the Victorian government's COVID debt repayment plan, which is causing real headaches for investors. Now, this, of course, is a flow through of the pandemic lockdown periods and, of course, the Andrews government and their policy there. It's fair to say if Dan Andrews was in power today, Jackie, he would not be winning any popularity contest because most investors in Melbourne have been whacked with an additional $975 a year tax that obviously is there to help the state repay their COVID debts. And in instances, they're even getting whacked with an increased rate of land tax. Throw this on top of vacant residential land tax and absentee owner tax. There's a fair few things that investors need to obviously kick the tin for as a result of obviously the legislation that's in place in Melbourne. So we are seeing, I guess, great evidence of a shift to owner-occupier activity, in Melbourne in particular as a result of that. Now, obviously, we're also seeing rental increases, so yields are improving. So it will only be a matter of time before, I guess, that shifts and turns the corner. Melbourne has been a great performer over the last 3 decades. In case it's actually been the best performing market in the country over the last 3 decades. So like all greats, won't be long before we see a comeback, I'm sure.
And so can you walk us through the list of upcoming suburbs for first home buyers?
Well, we've given Melbourne a bit of a whack today, Jackie, so I wanted to put a bit of a positive spin on it. So let's talk about some of the best upcoming suburbs for first home buyers in Melbourne. Now, we touched on affordability and the challenges for first home buyers a little bit earlier. So we're going to look at those homes that would fall under the home guarantee scheme. So obviously for homeowners, first home buyers to qualify, the purchase price needs to be under $800,000. For a home purchased in Melbourne and Geelong, and below $650,000 for the rest of the state. So we're going to focus in on those price points and keep that as our headline budget. In Melbourne, in particular, there are 4 top suburbs right now. So Thomastown in Melbourne's north, where the median house price is just $685,000. So still really affordable. It's super gentrifying location, so there's a lot of change happening in Thomastown, and it's also got great accessibility to the city and to a lot of those high-paying jobs, which is really important and a huge factor in any long-term performance of any property market. We've also got 𝐓𝐢𝐸𝐿𝐸, which is again in Melbourne's north, where median prices are just $678,000. Altona Meadows, personal favourite of mine, southwest of Melbourne, $728,000 is a median house price there, and Albion in West Melbourne, where prices are just $744,000. Now, I'm going to put in my personal favourite here for you, Jackie. This is a suburb in Geelong. So for those who aren't familiar with Geelong, it's about an hour to the west of Melbourne, good train connectivity to the city, decent freeways, and a lot of great amenity within Geelong itself. Now, Belmont, a suburb there in Geelong, median house price is just $699,000. So what this really goes to show is that if you do a little bit of digging, there are some great affordable entry points into the market. Crazy to think that we're talking about $700,000 at a great affordable entry point, but this is the times that we live in. But again, I think the theme here is owner-occupiers and certainly first-home buyers needing to go and look at those locations where there might be still a little bit of change to happen, gentrifying locations. So suburbs in particular where an older demographic is shifting to a younger demographic. That's a real theme in what we're seeing in those 5 suburbs that we mentioned. So the typical demographic is younger families in their early 30s who are getting in, doing the hard yakka, obviously adding a bit of value to the home that they buy, and then improving the overall look and feel of a suburb. And again, that will drive demand and, of course, price growth in time.
Awesome. Sounds good for Melbourne.
It certainly is, Jackie. Yeah, lots to like, as I say. It's not in the headlines for the right reasons at the moment, but as I touched on earlier, the strength and the evidence base of the last 30 years would suggest it's only a matter of time before things turn around.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have any other cities there for us or just Melbourne for today?
Just Melbourne today, Jackie, but I think in our upcoming feature on affordable locations, we're going to do a bit of around the grounds. Let's have a look at all the states and really, I guess, handpick the best locations for first home buyers to consider.
I think that sounds like a great idea. So if you are looking to get into the market for the first time, make sure you stay tuned for that episode. Now, Tom, I do have one last question to finish. And this is probably every interviewee's least favourite question. Can you please provide us with a forecast for the property market moving forward?
Oh, what a popular question that one is. I tell you what, the poor buggers that often get whacked with this question are the economists out there. So I'm going to reference, I guess, an insight from economists that I follow and respect dearly. I think I really do admire his views and think there's a bit of substance behind what he talks about. But for economists out there today, and to quote the great Dolly Parton, they are busier than a one-legged man in a butt-kicking contest. Their opinions are in serious demand. It's such a difficult thing to do. We talk about, we'd all love to have the crystal ball, and certainly economists, as smart people, they do their research and they try and form an opinion based on an evidence base of what may happen in the future. But as I mentioned, there's one economist who not too long ago presented his view on the state of affairs in Melbourne, which may provide a hint, I think, to the near-term growth prospects for this once great southern housing market. Now, this was a statement made by 𝐓𝐢𝐻𝐸 chief economist Tim Reardon. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Tim, but great mind, and is obviously heavily involved in planning policy, in trying to influence planning policy around new housing release in Melbourne. Now, Tim's comments were made off the back of Victoria's plan to build 800,000 new dwellings in the next decades. Now, Tim suggested that this was aiming as high as former US President John F. Kennedy's famous 1961 proposal to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And I can certainly see Tim's point. For context, figures released by the Housing Industry Association show that the state has actually never built more than 67,000 homes and units in a single calendar year. So to reach this new goal of 800,000 new homes in the next 10 years, they're really going to need to up the ante to obviously target an annual delivery of 80,000 completions. Now, I don't think Tim was necessarily arguing with the strategy, but what he is concerned with is the lack of policy to support the achievement of that goal. It'll take a significant turnaround in planning policy in Melbourne in removing some of the red tape. Planning approvals in Melbourne are the slowest in the nation. So obviously what that means is there is absolute certainty that we need the supply side to be activated, but constraining that is ultimately the red tape and the slow turnaround of new housing supply. So again, we touched on this a lot today, Jackie, but supply demand are such major factors in terms of the overall health of the property market or price growth in the market. So certainly from Tim's perspective, he is suggesting that supply may well be constrained for a little while yet. So it perhaps may indicate a turnaround in that Victorian market before too long.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Tom, thank you so much for your knowledge and expertise. And for everyone watching, where can they contact you?
I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, Jackie. So obviously just search me, Tom Haigh, on LinkedIn. We've got a great website and resource in mymoneysorted.com.au. We've got a wealth of information for obviously property investors and first home buyers. And of course, on an upcoming episode with you, where we'll be talking about housing affordability, what are the best markets for first home buyers and investors to consider across the country. So looking forward to that one, Jackie.
Bring it on. Well, this video series is powered by Lydian Financial Services. So if you're watching this and if you need any help with borrowing, please get in contact with us. Now, Tom, thank you so much for your time, and I guess we'll see you next month for our next episode.
Looking forward to it, Jackie. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Tom. Bye.
Bye for now.